So what happens when someone who preaches violence becomes a victim of it themselves? It's a tough question, right? Today, we're diving into a really powerful thought experiment that makes us confront that tricky line between condemning violence and our right not to grieve for people who wish us harm.
Okay, so this whole thing kicks off with a real, actual statement from conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Back in 2024, he referred to the biblical mandate for stoning gay people as God's perfect law. And that one single, incredibly provocative statement, well, it becomes the catalyst for this fascinating and, let's be honest, deeply uncomfortable ethical puzzle. And this is where the analysis gets hypothetical. It asks us to imagine that a year later, Kirk is assassinated. Now, to be perfectly clear, this is not about celebrating anyone's death. Not at all. The point is to force an honest look at a really gut-wrenching question. How do you react when the victim of a violent act had themselves called for violence against others?
All right, so how are we going to tackle this? We're going to break it down into 4 key parts. First, we'll look at the fundamental dangers of any political violence. Then, the complicated legacy that a victim like this leaves behind. Third, we'll get into the ethics of refusing to grieve. And finally, we'll see how this all crashes into the ideas of free speech and accountability.
Okay, first up, the dangers of political violence. The starting point here is a really simple but powerful principle. No matter who the target is, this kind of violence is an attack on the very fabric of a democratic society.
So what are we actually talking about when we say political violence? Well, it's pretty much any physical harm that's driven by ideology. The whole point is to shut down debate and replace it with fear and force. It's a direct assault on the democratic process.
And the fallout from this stuff? It's huge. It chips away at our trust in institutions. It drives communities further and further apart, and it makes it way too easy to start dehumanizing people we disagree with. You know, there's also a clear pattern here in history. This kind of chaos often opens the door for authoritarian crackdowns. It just rips apart the social norms that keep us from, well, attacking each other.
And this leads to something the analysis calls the backlash paradox, which is this really tragic irony. The idea is that political violence almost always backfires. An assassination doesn't just get rid of a person. It risks turning them into a martyr. It can fire up their base, push away potential allies, and actually end up reversing whatever progress the attacker thought they were making.
All right, section 2. So we've just established this big principle, right? Violence is wrong, period. But this is where that simple idea just completely collides with the messy, complicated reality of this particular case.
To really get why Kirk's rhetoric was so harmful, we need to understand a pretty important concept, stochastic terrorism. This isn't someone giving a direct order, like, go do this. No, it's about creating a climate that's so toxic, so inflammatory, that it inspires random, lone individuals to lash out and commit violence on their own.
And this slide right here, this is it. This is the absolute heart of the conflict. On one side, you have the unwavering principle that political violence is wrong and needs to be condemned. But on the other side, you have the problem. The victim himself used his massive platform to call for violence. How on earth are you supposed to hold both of those truths at the same time?
And of course, this is hardly a new problem. The source points out a long history here, with clear parallels from Anita Bryant's anti-gay crusades in the 70s to Rush Limbaugh's long history of inflammatory rhetoric. That tragic link between hateful speech and real-world violence. Yeah, it's a well-documented and heartbreaking pattern.
Okay, part 3, refusing grief. This is where the essay really zeroes in on the reaction to the queer community's refusal to mourn and the hidden power dynamics that are just bubbling under the surface.
So, in this hypothetical scenario, after Kirk's death, something happens that's, well, pretty predictable. You get a lot of commentators criticizing the queer community's lack of mourning, calling their reaction uncivil. This response? It's a classic example of something called tone policing. So what is tone policing exactly? Well, it's when someone from a more privileged group focuses on the way a marginalized person is expressing themselves, their anger, their sadness, instead of focusing on the injustice that caused those feelings in the first place. It's basically a way of saying, hey, your anger makes me uncomfortable. Could you please be quieter? While completely ignoring the reason you're angry.
And what's fueling this kind of reaction? The analysis points directly to privilege. In this context, it's about straight privilege, the unearned advantage of not having to live with the daily fear that someone like Kirk's rhetoric creates. And that distance can make it really hard to understand the raw, visceral reaction of a community that was his target.
So you can see the two sides lining up, right? It's this fundamental clash. From one side, you have the demand for civility, for decorum, a demand to mourn this person. And from the other side, you have the targeted group saying, absolutely not. We refuse to perform grief for someone who publicly advocated for our eradication. It's a powerful rejection of hypocrisy.
All right, last section. Let's pull the lens all the way back and look at the big societal principles that frame this whole debate: free speech and accountability.
You really can't talk about this in the U.S. without talking about the law. And the legal reality, thanks to landmark cases like Brandenburg v. Ohio, is that free speech protects a lot of things, including hateful speech, unless it's likely to incite imminent, immediate violence. This means that as awful as Kirk's statements were, legally, they were almost certainly protected speech.
And this brings us to such a critical distinction that the essay makes. It's about two different kinds of rights clashing. Someone absolutely has the legal right to say, you should be more civil. But the queer community has an equal right to critique that demand, to call it insensitive, to call it unethical, and to point out the harm it does. It's a clash between a legal right and a powerful ethical argument.
So what's the solution here? Where do we go from here? The path forward proposed in the analysis isn't about censorship or taking away rights. Instead, it's about building empathy and education. It's about promoting a real understanding of privilege, amplifying the voices of targeted communities, and actually using the laws we already have to protect vulnerable groups.
And so, at the end of the day, we're left with this really tough lingering question, a question the essay leaves for us to grapple with. We can and we should condemn all political violence, but can we, or even should we, be expected to show empathy for a victim who showed absolutely none to others? That's a line that each of us really has to consider for ourselves.